There's something strange about the word old. It doesn't land all at once. It doesn't announce itself with a ceremony. It shows up quietly, in jokes, in tone, in the way people start explaining things slower than they used to, and sometimes it shows up in your own living room. My son said it on a Sunday afternoon. "You're too old to understand, Dad." He didn't yell it. He didn't slam the door. He said it the way younger people say things when they believe they're stating a fact, casually. "I'm 62 years old. My name is Robert Hayes. I spent 37 years running a regional construction supply business that my father started in 1974. I built that company from a warehouse with 2 forklifts into something that now moves materials across 3 states. I understand contracts, I understand leverage, I understand patience. What I didn't understand that afternoon was when my son stopped seeing me as capable. His name is Daniel, 34, MBA, tech startup energy, fast talker, quick thinker, the kind of man who checks his phone before finishing a sentence. He had come over to talk about the future of the company. Those were his words. We were sitting at my dining table, the same table where he used to do homework, the same table where his mother once cried when we almost lost the business in 2008. "Dad, the market is changing," he said. "We need to pivot, automate more, outsource distribution, modernize." I listened. "I've already spoken to a few investors," he added casually. That was the first shift. "Investors?" I asked. "Just exploratory talks, nothing serious." "Exploratory talks about my company, the one still legally in my name." I leaned back in my chair. "And what exactly are you proposing?" He pulled out his tablet and started showing me slides. Growth projections, efficiency curves, cost reductions. Staffing cuts. Staffing cuts. "Those are people who've worked here 20 years, I said. "They're overhead," he replied. "Overhead." I studied him carefully. "When were you planning to tell me about the investors?" He sighed slightly. That small, impatient exhale. "This is what I mean, Dad. You get emotional. You don't see the bigger picture." "And what's the bigger picture?" I asked calmly. "That the company can be worth triple in 5 years if we move fast. And if we don't?" He shrugged. "Then we stagnate." Silence settled between us. Then he said it. "You're too old to understand how this works now." Not angry, not cruel, just dismissive. Like he had already decided something about me. I didn't react immediately. People expect older men to defend themselves loudly. I've learned something about power over the years. The louder someone assumes you are irrelevant, the quieter you should become. "Explain it to me," I said. He blinked. "What?" "Explain it like I'm too old to understand." He didn't catch the shift in tone. He launched into a simplified explanation about digital transformation and lean restructuring. I let him finish. Then I asked one question. "Who owns 51% of the company?" He paused. "You do." "And who has final voting authority on structural changes?" "You do." "And who signed the operating agreement that restricts external investment without unanimous approval?" His jaw tightened. "You did." "And who taught you how to read contracts?" I asked. Silence. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't, because this wasn't about contracts. It was about perception. He stood up from the table. "You're being defensive." "No," I said. "I'm being careful." He picked up his tablet. "You built something great. I respect that. But things are different now." "Different doesn't mean better," I replied. He shook his head. "This is exactly what I'm talking about." He walked toward the door, then stopped. "You're too attached." That's the problem. Attached. To the employees who stayed through recessions. To the warehouse manager who mortgaged his house once to help us cover payroll. To the drivers who know every client by first name. Yes, I'm attached. He left without slamming the door, but the quiet felt louder than any argument. That night, I sat alone in my office at the warehouse. The building hums differently after 8 p.m. The forklifts are still. The loading bays echo. I opened the operating agreement. I read every clause. Then I opened something else, the trust document. There are things sons assume about their fathers. They assume we've already passed control emotionally, even if not legally. Daniel assumed he was already steering the ship. He wasn't. Not yet. I wasn't angry. Anger is reactive. What I felt was clarity. If he believed I was too old to understand, then perhaps I needed to show him exactly what I understood. I picked up the phone and I made one call. The call I made wasn't dramatic, it wasn't shouted, it wasn't emotional, it was measured. "Frank," I said when he answered. "Frank Delaney has been our corporate attorney for 25 years. He was there when we expanded into Connecticut. He was there when we nearly folded in 2008. He understands paperwork the way a surgeon understands anatomy." "Bob," he said, "everything all right?" "I need to review the shareholder structure," I replied, "and I want to revisit the succession clause." There was a pause. "That's sudden." "Not really," I said, "just overdue." We scheduled a meeting for the following morning. I didn't sleep much that night, not because I was worried, because I was thinking. There's a difference between aging and surrendering. Daniel assumed they were the same thing. They aren't. The next morning, I walked into Frank's office with a folder under my arm. We went through everything. Ownership percentages, voting rights, succession triggers, the family trust structure I quietly established 12 years ago after my wife passed. Daniel owns 49%. I retained 51. On paper, that difference looks small. In practice, it is absolute. "There's also the performance clause," Frank reminded me. I nodded. The clause Daniel never paid attention to. "If operational decisions materially endanger long-term stability, controlling authority can temporarily suspend executive control." It was written after a disagreement we had when he first joined the company at 26. He had been ambitious then too. Ambition isn't the problem. Impatience is. "Are you planning to trigger it?" Frank asked. "Not yet," I said. "Then what?" I slid a second document across the desk. "Board restructuring." He read it slowly. "You're expanding advisory oversight?" "Yes." "And adding who?" 3 external senior advisors, former industry executives. Frank leaned back. "You're building a buffer. I'm building accountability." Daniel wanted investors. I was bringing in experience. There's a difference. When I returned to the warehouse that afternoon, Daniel was in my office. He had let himself in. "We need to talk," he said. "About what?" "I've already told. 2 potential investors were moving forward." I set my briefcase down calmly. "You shouldn't have done that." His jaw tightened. "Why?" "Because nothing is moving forward." "You don't get it, Dad. Explain it to me." He ran his hands through his hair. "You're slowing this down because you're afraid of change." "No," I said evenly. "I'm slowing this down because I've seen what happens when growth outpaces structure. You're holding us back. Us. Interesting word choice." "There is no us in ownership," I replied. "There is majority and minority." His face changed slightly. "You wouldn't." "I wouldn't what?" "Undermine me." "I'm not undermining you," I said. "I'm supervising you." He laughed once. Sharp. "You think you're still in charge?" "I am still in charge." Silence. He didn't like hearing it. Over the next week, I implemented the advisory board quietly. 3 men, all over 60, all with 40 years of industry experience, all who had built and sold companies larger than ours. I introduced them at the quarterly operations meeting. Daniel didn't know until they walked in. His expression told me everything. "This isn't necessary," he said afterward in my office. "It's absolutely necessary. You're bringing in dinosaurs to judge modern strategy." "Experience isn't a dinosaur," I replied. "It's insurance." He paced. "You're embarrassing me. By protecting the company, by not trusting me." That was the real issue. Trust. "Trust is earned in stages," I said calmly. "Not demanded." He stared at me. "You really think I'm not capable?" "No," I replied. "I think you're not finished learning." 2 weeks later, the first investor withdrew. Not because of me, because the advisory board asked hard questions. Questions Daniel couldn't answer without speculation. Revenue projections that assumed perfect execution. Cost reductions that ignored long-term retention risk. Staff cuts that threatened operational continuity. Frank once told me something valuable. "You can tell the maturity of a leader by how they react to resistance." Daniel reacted with frustration, not reflection. That told me we weren't ready to pivot at the speed he wanted. One evening he confronted me in the warehouse after everyone had left. "You're doing this to prove a point." "No," I said. "I'm doing this to protect what your grandfather built." That's emotional. That's responsibility. You think I don't care? I think you care about valuation more than legacy. That hit him. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said it again. "You're too old to see where the world is going." This time, I didn't let it pass. "I've seen 3 recessions," I said quietly. "I've negotiated through 2 supply chain collapses. I've outlasted 5 competitors who thought speed was strategy. Don't confuse youth with foresight." He looked away first. That night, I made a second call, not to Frank, to the bank. Daniel had quietly initiated preliminary restructuring financing discussions without formal approval. Nothing illegal, but premature. I instructed the bank to freeze any restructuring conversations unless signed by both majority and minority owners. Within 24 hours, Daniel received the notification. He stormed into my office. "You froze the financing talks?" I paused them. "You don't trust me at all." "I trust process." He slammed his palm lightly against the desk. "You're afraid of becoming irrelevant." That's when I understood something clearly. This wasn't about business. This was about identity. He saw himself rising, and he saw me standing in the doorway, blocking light. He didn't realize something important. Doors don't block light. They control when it enters. The advisory board meeting that followed was uncomfortable. One of the advisors, Thomas Green, spoke directly to Daniel. "You have vision," Thomas said, "but vision without patience burns cash." Daniel bristled. "You built your company in a different era." Thomas nodded calmly. "Every era punishes overconfidence the same way." That landed. For the first time, Daniel was silent in a room full of older men, not because they overpowered him, because they outlasted him. 3 days later, he didn't come to work. Instead, I received an email. He was considering stepping down if he didn't have operational freedom. That's when I made the third call. This one mattered most. The third call wasn't to a lawyer, it wasn't to the bank, it wasn't even to one of the advisors, it was to my father. Well, not literally. He passed away 8 years ago, but I keep his old ledger in the bottom drawer of my office desk. The first accounting book he used when the company was nothing more than a rented warehouse and a handshake agreement with 3 suppliers. I opened it that night. His handwriting was firm, direct, numbers written with discipline. Notes scribbled in the margins. "Slow growth survives. Never borrow what you can't repay twice. Protect the men who protect the work." Daniel never read those pages. He grew up in the finished version of the company, air-conditioned offices, digital inventory, predictable payroll. He never saw the winter when we heated the warehouse with portable propane tanks to keep materials from freezing. He never saw the week I didn't pay myself so drivers could take home their checks. He saw stability. He assumed it had always been there. I closed the ledger and leaned back in my chair. The problem wasn't ambition. It was memory. The next morning I drove to Daniel's apartment. He opened the door after the third knock. "You came here." "To lecture me?" he asked. "No." He stepped aside reluctantly. His apartment was modern, glass desk, 2 monitors. Everything sleek and optimized. I sat down across from him. "Do you know why I gave you 49% instead of 40? I asked. He frowned slightly. "You said it was symbolic." "It wasn't." He crossed his arms. "It was leverage," I continued. "For both of us." "For what?" "For the day you thought you were ready." He didn't respond. "You think I'm holding you back?" I said calmly. "I think I'm preventing you from making a mistake that could take 15 years to recover from. You don't believe in my plan. I don't believe in your timing." He shook his head. "That's the same thing." "No, it's not." Silence. Then I said something I hadn't planned to say. "If I were too old to understand, I would have signed whatever you put in front of me." That landed. "You think this is a test?" he asked. "It is." "Of what?" "Of whether you can lead without dismissing the people who built the ground you're standing on." He looked at the floor. For the first time since this started, his confidence cracked slightly. "I don't want to be you," he said quietly. "I don't want you to be me," I replied. He looked up. I want you to be better. That stop. Him. You just don't get how fast things move now. I get it, I said. You don't get how fast things collapse. We sat there for a long moment. Then I said the words that mattered. I'm not blocking your future. I'm pacing it. He exhaled slowly. And if I don't agree, then you can sell your 49%. His head snapped up. You'd buy me out? Yes. With what? With the same patience you're calling outdated. That wasn't a threat, it was clarity. He didn't respond for 2 days, then he showed up at the warehouse early, before me. That was new. When I walked in, he was already reviewing supplier contracts. I ran the numbers again, he said without looking up. And if we automate distribution too fast, we lose 3 regional managers who carry key client relationships. Yes. And if we outsource warehousing immediately, we void 2 long-term supplier agreements. Yes. He finally looked at me. You knew that. I did. Why didn't you just say it? Because you wouldn't have listened. He nodded once. That was progress. The advisory board met again the following week. This time, Daniel presented a revised proposal. Slower integration timeline, no immediate staffing cuts. Gradual automation phases. Investor conversations postponed 6 months. Thomas Green leaned back in his chair. Better, he said. Daniel didn't smile, but he didn't bristle either. After the meeting, we stood alone in my office. I shouldn't have said you were too old, he said quietly. No, I replied. I was frustrated. I know. I don't think you're irrelevant. I know, he hesitated, but I do want more responsibility. You'll have it. When you stop confusing speed with leadership. That answer didn't satisfy him fully, but it didn't anger him either. It made him think. 3 months later, we implemented the first phase of modernization, gradually, carefully, without layoffs, without investor pressure, without shortcuts. Revenue didn't triple overnight, but it climbed steadily, and more importantly, it held. One evening, as we locked up the warehouse together, Daniel stopped near the loading bay. You know what I realized? He said. What? You weren't afraid of change. No. You were afraid of losing control. No, I said calmly. I was afraid of losing stability. He nodded slowly. That's different. Yes. He looked around the warehouse. You really did build something. I did, and I don't want to wreck it. Then don't rush it. The last advisory meeting of the quarter ended with something unexpected. Thomas Green stood up and addressed Daniel directly. You're learning, he said. That's what matters. Daniel glanced at me briefly. For the first time, there wasn't tension in his expression. There was acknowledgement. 2 weeks later, he came into my office. With a folder. What's that? I asked. He slid it across the desk. Revised succession plan. Expanded leadership transition timeline. 3-year structured authority shift. Majority stake transfer staged over performance benchmarks. You're serious? I asked. Yes. You wrote this? Yes. I read it carefully. It was thoughtful, measured, not reactive. You're not too old, he said quietly. I looked up. You just think longer. That was enough. I signed the revised succession document 2 weeks later. Not because Daniel pressured me, because he earned it. There's a difference between handing over control and preparing someone to carry it. Most fathers mistake the first for the second. Wasn't going to make that mistake. The next board meeting felt different. Daniel spoke slower. He paused before answering. He asked the advisors for input instead of defending every point. And when Thomas challenged a projection, Daniel didn't argue. He recalculated. That's when I knew the lesson had landed. Not the business lesson, the perspective lesson. One afternoon, months later, we were reviewing quarterly results in my office. Revenue was up, not explosive, but strong. Operating. Costs had decreased without layoffs. Client retention remained stable. Daniel closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. You know what the hardest part was? He asked. What? Realizing you weren't blocking me. You were protecting me. I smiled slightly. I wasn't protecting you, I said. I was protecting the company. He laughed softly. Same thing. Maybe, Maybe not. A week later, we had dinner at my house, the same dining table where this whole thing started. Daniel looked around and said, "I remember doing math homework here." "You hated fractions," I replied. He smiled. "I thought you didn't understand anything back then either." "Most sons do," I said. He grew quiet for a moment. "I shouldn't have said you were too old to understand." "No," I agreed. "But you weren't wrong about one thing," he continued. "What's that?" "The world is moving faster." "It is. So how do you keep up?" I looked at him carefully. "You don't chase speed," I said. "You build structure that survives it." He nodded slowly. That was the difference between us. He saw motion, I saw foundation. Neither was wrong, but only one lasts. A few months after that, Daniel led a client negotiation on his own. I sat quietly in the room, didn't interrupt, didn't correct, didn't signal. He handled it well, not perfectly, but responsibly. When the client left, he turned to me. "You didn't step in, you didn't need me to." He smiled slightly. That smile wasn't cocky, it was earned. There's a strange shift that happens when your son stops competing with you and starts building beside you. The tension fades. Respect replaces it, not because one defeated the other, because both adjusted. One evening, as we locked up the warehouse together, Daniel paused at the door. "Dad?" "Yes." "If I ever start moving too fast again?" "I will," I said. He laughed. "Fair." We stood there for a moment in the quiet hum of the building. "You know," he added, "I thought saying you were too old would push you to step aside, and it pushed you to tighten the reins instead." "Yes." "Why?" "Because control isn't something you surrender under insult," I said. "It's something you transfer under readiness." He absorbed that. Slowly. That was progress. 6 months later, the advisory board voted unanimously to shift more operational authority to Daniel. I agreed, not because I was pressured, because I trusted him. Trust built slowly survives longer than trust demanded quickly. One morning, almost a year after the original argument, Daniel walked into my office holding coffee for both of us. "Peace offering?" I asked. "Recognition," he replied. "For what?" "For not stepping aside just because I was impatient." He handed me the cup. "You weren't too old to understand," he said. "You just understood things I hadn't lived yet." That was the closest he would come to an apology. It was enough. There's something people misunderstand about aging. They think relevance fades with wrinkles. It doesn't. Irrelevance comes from surrendering perspective. Perspective comes from surviving. Cycles. Daniel had ambition. I had cycles. Now he has both. That afternoon, I opened the ledger again, my father's handwriting still firm. "Protect the men who protect the work." I closed it and placed it back in the drawer. The business will eventually be Daniel's, but not because he rushed it, because he matured into it. The last time he referenced that Sunday afternoon, it was in passing. "I can't believe I said you. We're too old," he said, shaking his head. "You did. Were you angry?" "No." "What were you?" "Certain." "About what?" "That you still had something to learn." He laughed. "And you didn't?" "I always do," I said. "That's the final truth most sons don't see. Fathers don't stop learning. We just stop announcing it." He thought. I was too old to understand. So I made one phone call, not to punish him, not to embarrass him, but to protect what mattered long enough for him to see clearly. Sometimes leadership isn't about stepping forward. It's about standing still long enough for someone else to catch up. And when they do, you don't remind them who was right, you remind them what was built. That's the last word.